Imagine this, you're driving through your neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary, but suddenly, a truck covered in racist flags cuts you off, and the moment you try to react, they hurl insults at you. How would you feel? Would you stay silent, or would you stand up for yourself? Marcus Trent wasn't one to be easily pushed around. He was a Marine, a decorated veteran, hardened by battle and forged through the fire of military training. But when he faced this situation, it wasn't because of a lack of confidence. It was because Marcus knew one very important thing. Confronting hatred and racism isn't always about reacting immediately. Sometimes, the most powerful response is silence, waiting for the right moment to strike back, not out of anger, but out of control and precision. Marcus's neighborhood was far from ordinary. It was meticulously built, with its perfect lawns, pristine houses, and manicured streets. On the surface, it was a picture of suburban tranquility, but behind the gleaming facades, Marcus saw a different reality. This neighborhood, like many others, was built on appearances of a veneer of kindness that hid deep-seated fears and prejudices. The type of place where a black man like Marcus, despite his military service and sacrifice, could never fully be accepted. There were nods of acknowledgement, but not greetings. Eyes that quickly turn away rather than meeting his. The uneasy silence was deafening, and Marcus, though not naive to the existence of racism, had learned to navigate such spaces in his life. When the truck cut him off at that red light, it wasn't just another traffic annoyance, it was an affirmation of everything Marcus already knew about this world. The white couple inside, with their Confederate flags and racist slogans, assumed that he'd be another black man to take their abuse quietly, and they would drive away, thinking that he was too weak to respond. But Marcus, the Marine, wasn't going to let that moment slip by without at least giving them a taste of what it meant to stand up. Marcus's neighborhood wasn't just a place for living, it was a reflection of the world's deeper problems. The flags flying proudly outside some homes weren't just decorations, they were silent statements of exclusion. As Marcus drove through his quiet neighborhood, he knew that the wave of hate the couple projected wasn't just a what-I'm incident. It was a microcosm of a larger issue he faced daily, a constant reminder that his mere existence challenged the status quo for some people. Despite how calm and clean things appeared on the surface, Marcus understood that this silence and avoidance from neighbors were a form of fear of facing the truth of their own biases. Many of them knew exactly what the couple in the truck represented, but they chose to look the other way. They smiled, but their eyes said something else. For Marcus, that was something he couldn't ignore, not anymore. Marcus was a man of inner strength. He wasn't someone who showed his emotions easily, but that didn't mean they didn't exist. He was trained to withstand pain and frustration, to push forward when the world around him seemed designed to break him down. In his time in the military, he'd learned restraint, the kind that wasn't about bottling up his feelings, but about choosing when to act, when to make his move. And that day, when the couple in the truck hurled their insults at him, Marcus didn't react with anger. He didn't escalate the situation. He could have, but instead, he stayed calm, composed, like the Marine he was trained to be. His decision not to immediately fight back wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a calculated move. Marcus knew that there was power in restraint, power in letting the other side believe they had the upper hand, all while silently preparing for the right moment to act. This moment was no different from the countless ones he had experienced during his deployments. In the heat of battle, he had been taught that victory didn't come from hasty decisions, but from measured actions. And this was no different. He would not let the hate they threw at him define him or force him into a reactionary response. No, he would wait. He would wait for the perfect moment. The next day, when Marcus pulled into his driveway after running a few errands, he didn't expect to find anything out of the ordinary. But as he reached his front door and looked up, his heart sank. The quiet, neatly kept facade of his home had been violated. His garage door was splattered with spray paint. The words they'd hurled at him just a day before were now smeared across his property, racial slurs that no one should ever have to see. His American flag, once proudly displayed, was torn and thrown onto the ground, desecrated. His medals, his achievements, his service were torn from their place of honor and smashed to pieces. They hadn't just vandalized his property, they'd vandalized his identity, his pride, his past, his commitment to this country, to the ideals of freedom and justice, had been ripped apart in a single act of hate. But Marcus wasn't going to let this moment define him. As Marcus stood there, staring at the destruction in front of him, a deep, burning anger began to well up inside him. But it wasn't the type of rage that would cloud his judgment. This wasn't about losing his temper. No, this was something much colder, more calculated. It was the kind of anger that comes from knowing you've been disrespected in ways that no person should ever endure. It wasn't just about the flag or the medals. It was about sending a message, about making sure that people like Doug and Sherry understood that there were consequences for their actions, consequences they couldn't avoid. At that moment, Marcus felt the weight of everything that had led to this point. He had served his country with honor, sacrificed parts of himself, and endured hardship. He had come back to this, to a world where some people still didn't understand what it meant to be truly free, to be equal, and yet, despite the violence of the moment, Marcus found the strength to remain composed. He didn't scream, he didn't lash out. Instead, he stood there quietly, breathing through his anger, making a mental note of everything he would need to do next. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. What Doug and Sherry didn't understand was that Marcus had been here before. He had faced the hate, the whispers, and the sideways glances. But every time he did, it didn't get easier. It didn't stop hurting. The problem with racism wasn't just the overt acts of violence, it was the insidious, everyday ways it eroded a person's sense of self-worth, their dignity, the long history of being looked at as less than, of being told you don't belong, of being made to feel like you're an outsider in your own home. That was the real battle, and that battle was one Marcus had been fighting long before he ever encountered Doug and Sherry. In that moment, Marcus wasn't just confronting the couple who had attacked him. He was confronting a system that had allowed people like them to go unchecked for so long. It was an invisible enemy that had been there all along, waiting to rear its ugly head whenever it could. But Marcus wasn't going to let it win. He couldn't, for himself, for the country he had fought for, and for those who would come after him. Instead of reacting impulsively, Marcus decided to take a different approach. He would track Doug and Sherry's movements, gather information, and bide his time. This wasn't about fighting back out of anger. It was about taking control of the situation. Marcus had spent years in the military learning how to be patient, how to wait for the right moment. He knew that there was no rush. The key now was to learn everything he could about his enemies, about the couple who thought they could intimidate him. Every move, every habit, every place they went, he would know it all. For Marcus, this was a game of strategy. He wasn't going to go in blindly and make a mistake. He had too much to lose. Instead, he would watch, wait, and strike only when the time was right. And when it came, he would make sure they understood that this wasn't over. They had crossed a line, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. This approach wasn't just strategic, it was necessary. Many people who have faced discrimination and hatred don't have the luxury of fighting back immediately. For many, the system doesn't provide immediate justice, and so they have to be patient, wait for the right opportunities. They must learn to navigate the world with caution and intelligence, not acting out of anger, but out of necessity. Marcus understood this deeply. His years of service had taught him how to remain calm under pressure, to see the bigger picture and not be blinded by immediate reactions. Many who are marginalized know the feeling of having to play the long game, whether it's in the workplace, in a neighborhood, or even in the courtroom. They understand that victory doesn't always come from direct confrontation. Sometimes it's about gathering information, building a case, and waiting for the right moment to act. And Marcus was a master of this. As Marcus began his quiet investigation, he observed Doug and Sherry from a distance. He watched them leave their house, go to the local store, visit the same dive bar every night. He took note of their habits, the places they frequented, and the people they interacted with. Nothing about their lives was extraordinary. In fact, the more he observed them, the more he realized how predictable they were. Doug, the one who seemed to be the ringleader, had a swagger about him, a full sense of power that came from his privilege. Sherry, on the other hand, was more reserved, but just as dangerous, hiding behind her words and her deflection of blame. What struck Marcus the most was how comfortable they were in their hatred. It wasn't even something they tried to hide. The flags on their truck, the stickers with hateful slogans, were all part of their identity. They weren't just defending their actions, they were proud of them. And that pride, that arrogance, was their biggest mistake. They thought they could get away with it because, for so long, they had. As Marcus followed them from a distance, keeping an eye on their every move, he began to realize how predictable they were. Doug had a routine. He would leave for work at the same time every day, go to the same gas stations, and drink the same beer at the same bar. Sherry wasn't any different. She would stay home most days, doing nothing of particular importance, except for making sure she kept up with her daily routine of mocking the world around her. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The clock was ticking. Every day that passed brought him closer to the moment when he would finally confront them, when they would realize they had made a terrible mistake. They thought they could break him, but they had no idea who they were messing with. Marcus continued his surveillance on Doug and Sherry, observing their daily routines with meticulous attention. Each movement, each interaction, was cataloged in his mind. He wasn't just gathering information for revenge. He was laying the groundwork for something far more powerful, an eventual reckoning that Doug and Sherry would never see coming. It wasn't about instant gratification. It was about teaching them a lesson that would resonate far beyond the immediate moment. As days passed, Marcus felt a sense of quiet satisfaction in the control he now held over the situation. He had learned the rhythms of their lives. He knew where they shopped, when they went to the bar, and where they liked to hang out. Every evening, Marcus would return home, sit on his porch, and reflect on what he had learned that day. The quiet routine of his evenings was a contrast to the chaos he knew was soon to come. But he wasn't in a rush. Marcus had learned a long time ago that revenge, when delivered with precision, could be far more effective than a hasty reaction. I think what makes this part of Marcus's journey so significant is his patience. It's easy to react out of anger, to lash out when someone has hurt us. But Marcus's approach, patient, observant, and strategic, is one that many of us could learn from. In a world that often encourages immediate reactions, Marcus shows us the power of stillness. He doesn't rush into battle. Instead, he waits for the right time, the right moment to strike. It's a valuable lesson for anyone dealing with injustice. Sometimes, holding back and waiting can be far more powerful than an impulsive response. Marcus understood that by remaining patient and waiting for the perfect moment to act, he was taking control of the situation. He wasn't letting Doug and Sherry dictate the pace or the outcome of this encounter. By observing them carefully, Marcus was not just learning their patterns, he was also showing them something important, that he wouldn't be pushed around. He was willing to wait. He was willing to give them enough rope to hang themselves. This tactic was one that he had been taught in the military. Patience and precision were often more effective than rushing in with guns blazing. It was a concept that extended far beyond the battlefield of life, especially when it came to dealing with hate and prejudice, required the same level of discipline. Marcus wasn't interested in reacting to Doug and Sherry's provocation. He was preparing them for the consequences of their actions in a way they would never expect. During this time, Marcus began to think about the larger picture. He wasn't just after Doug and Sherry's apology or an eye for an eye. No, Marcus wanted to show the man everyone around him that actions have consequences. They had thought they could desecrate his home and violate his dignity with no repercussions. But Marcus knew that the only way to truly make an impact was to ensure that their behavior was seen and acknowledged. The impact wouldn't come from some grand, dramatic fight. It would come from them realizing that the world they lived in, a world where people like Marcus were treated as less than, was shifting beneath their feet. Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or oppressed. Many of us have been in a situation where we've been wronged, where someone has attacked our character or violated our personal space. The instinct is to retaliate, to strike back and get even. But the reality is that quick retaliation often doesn't bring the kind of justice we seek. True justice comes when we force those who wronged us to confront the consequences of their actions in the long term. It's about making them understand that their behavior won't be tolerated, not just by us, but by society as a whole. This is what Marcus was working towards, not an immediate response, but a slow, deliberate lesson in accountability. As Marcus continued to follow Doug and Sherry, he realized something about them that they had failed to see in themselves. They were predictable. Their lives were defined by their hatred. But that hatred was also a weakness. It made them act without thought, without regard for the bigger picture. Doug, with his macho bravado and his obsession with his own image, was too proud to see how transparent he was. Sherry, though quieter, was just as complicit in their actions. She was just as toxic, just as dangerous, but she hid it behind a veneer of passivity. Marcus understood that the key to this confrontation wasn't just in confronting Doug or Sherry directly. It was in showing them and everyone else that their behavior was part of a larger, systemic issue. They weren't isolated. They were a part of a broader cultural problem that couldn't be ignored. As the days wore on, Marcus's resolve grew stronger. He knew he had the upper hand now. Doug and Sherry were the ones who were being watched. They were the ones who didn't know that the tables had turned. They thought they were the ones who had control. But Marcus knew that every day that passed, every move they made, was one step closer to their inevitable downfall. He wasn't just waiting for them to make a mistake. He was waiting for the perfect opportunity to make them realize that their actions would have consequences. The real lesson would come not from an immediate confrontation, but from them seeing their own downfall unfold before their eyes. Finally, after weeks of careful observation, Marcus knew the time had come. Doug and Sherry had made a mistake. They had underestimated him, and now Marcus would make sure they understood exactly what they had done. After weeks of waiting and watching, Marcus finally knew it was time. Doug and Sherry had made their mistake, and now the reckoning was upon them. Marcus didn't need to rush in with fury. He wasn't about to make a spectacle of himself or fall into the trap of an impulsive reaction. No, this was the moment he had been preparing for. This was the time when they would finally see the consequences of their actions, not through a dramatic display of violence, but through quiet, calculated precision. Marcus had studied Doug and Sherry's movements long enough to know where they would be. He knew where they liked to go, when they'd be out, and even the best routes to take. He had anticipated every possible scenario, and now, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty streets, Marcus set his plan into motion, and like what Doug and Sherry might have expected, Marcus didn't charge at them with rage. Instead, he moved with the calm of someone who had already made up his mind, someone who had nothing left to prove. As he approached the clearing where Doug and Sherry had parked, he wasn't thinking about revenge. He wasn't thinking about anger. What he was thinking about was making them face their own consequences quietly, deliberately, and without hesitation. When Marcus walked toward them, it wasn't with the purpose of physical confrontation. It was to make them realize how insignificant they were in the grand scheme of things. They had thought they were the ones who controlled the situation, but now it was clear that Marcus was the one holding all the power. The idea of justice often brings up images of courtroom battles, loud speeches, and passionate arguments. But Marcus knew that real justice doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes, it's the quiet moments, the ones where a person stands tall and makes others see their wrongs, that deliver the strongest messages. What Marcus did here wasn't about proving his strength. It was about showing Doug and Sherry that they had underestimated him, that their hate had no place in his life. Justice wasn't about anger. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about making them face the reality of their actions. For Marcus, this was the key to true justice. Not retaliation, but a quiet, intentional assertion of dignity. As Marcus stepped closer to the truck, Doug and Sherry immediately took notice. Their smug expressions faltered as they recognized him. Doug, ever the tough guy, stepped forward with the kind of arrogance that came from years of thinking he could bully people into submission. His chest puffed out as if his physical presence alone would intimidate Marcus into backing down. But Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply locked eyes with Doug, his calmness making Doug's bravado seem even more pathetic. Doug's first words were meant to provoke. "You think you're tough, huh? You really think you can walk around here acting like you belong?" He sneered, trying to play to the crowd of his own delusions. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the gap between them. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was exactly what Marcus wanted. Doug wasn't used to silence. He was used to confrontation, to verbal jabs, and he didn't know how to respond to someone who wasn't feeding into his anger. Sherry, on the other hand, stepped forward too, her voice sharp and accusatory. "You people always want to play the victim," she spat, her words dripping with contempt. "You think you deserve special treatment because you wore a fancy uniform and drive a nice car. What's the point of all that, huh?" Marcus turned to her, his gaze unshaken, and in a calm but firm voice, he asked, "What exactly do you mean by you people?" Her words caught in her throat for a moment. Doug, eager to back up his partner, barked, "You don't belong here. This isn't your kind of place. You're not one of us." And that was when Marcus snapped. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't shout back. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had seen far worse and knew how to handle a situation. His words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a warning. "I earned everything I have. I fought for this country. You have no right to tell me where I belong," Marcus stated, his voice steady. Doug's face twisted in frustration. His hands balled into fists, and with a wild yell, he lunged at Marcus, as if his physical aggression could somehow take Marcus down. But Marcus was ready. He had been trained for this moment, not just in physical combat, but in controlling the situation. Doug's desperate swing was nothing more than an opening for Marcus to redirect the aggression. With a quick motion, Marcus caught Doug's wrist mid-swing, using his own momentum against him. Doug stumbled forward, completely off balance, and fell to the ground with a thud. Sherry screamed in the background, but Marcus didn't even look at her. His focus was on Doug, who was now on the ground. Struggling to regain his composure, Marcus didn't rush to kick him while he was down. Instead, he let Doug realize that the game had changed. Doug wasn't in control anymore. What stands out to me in this part of Marcus's journey is his use of restraint. He doesn't need to prove anything to Doug or Sherry. He doesn't need to show them that he's stronger, faster, or better. He simply needs them to understand that their behavior has consequences and they've already crossed a line that they can't undo. Marcus doesn't feel the need to escalate the violence. He doesn't want to get into a physical fight with them. He's already won by showing them that he's above their petty provocations. In a world where it's often expected that the oppressed will retaliate with violence or anger, Marcus flips the script. He shows that true power isn't in the physical confrontation, it's in the control of the situation. His calmness in the face of aggression speaks volumes, and it's the kind of response that forces the other side to see themselves for what they truly are. With Doug still on the ground, gasping for air, Marcus turned to Sherry. Her bravado had faded. She was no longer the confident, mocking figure who had tried to insult him earlier. Instead, she was now the one shaking, terrified of the consequences of her actions. Marcus knew that this wasn't the time to punish her. It was the time to let her feel the weight of her own fear, a fear that came from realizing just how close they had come to making things much worse for themselves. Doug, still lying on the ground, tried to push himself up, but struggled to find his footing. Marcus didn't offer him any help. He didn't need to. The power had shifted, and Doug could now feel it. Marcus wasn't just standing tall. He was standing above them metaphorically and literally. He had already made his point. This moment in the confrontation speaks to a deeper truth that many people face when dealing with aggression or hatred. It's often tempting to retaliate, to give in to the urge to show the aggressor how strong you are. But Marcus's response shows that true strength lies in control. In the face of anger, restraint is the real power. How many times have we seen a situation escalate unnecessarily because one person couldn't control their emotions? Marcus teaches us that it's not the immediate response that matters, it's how we choose to respond after the storm has passed. The tension in the air was palpable as Doug lay on the ground, trying to recover from the humbling moment. His pride was shattered, and the rage that had once fueled his actions was now a dim echo in the back of his mind. For the first time, he understood that someone like Marcus wasn't going to break, wasn't going to bow to his aggression. Marcus hadn't just physically overcome Doug, he had dismantled the very foundation of Doug's arrogance. Marcus didn't need to physically dominate him. His presence alone was enough to make Doug realize the futility of his actions. As Doug struggled to stand, his face red with embarrassment and anger, Marcus didn't take another step forward. He didn't need to. He had already won this battle. Doug's body language said it all. He wasn't in control anymore. The power dynamic had completely shifted. Sherry, meanwhile, remained frozen, her fear now evident in her wide eyes and trembling hands. She had stepped into this confrontation believing they were the ones who could control the situation. But now, it was clear that they had miscalculated. She had thought that their hate-filled words would break Marcus, but instead, they had only exposed the fragility of their own position. Marcus didn't say anything to them at that moment. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, allowing the silence to speak for him. He wasn't interested in prolonging the confrontation. He had made his point, and now, all that was left was the aftermath. What strikes me most about this final moment is how Marcus chose not to humiliate his attackers any further. In a world that often rewards aggression and violence, Marcus chose humility and restraint. He didn't seek retribution in the traditional sense. Instead, he used his strength to show Doug and Sherry that their actions had consequences. And those consequences didn't come in the form of physical violence alone. There is a profound power in this kind of humility. It's not about getting even. It's about showing the aggressors that their behavior is unacceptable, and doing so in a way that doesn't diminish you as a person. Marcus doesn't let Doug and Sherry off the hook, but he doesn't need to lower himself to their level to make his point. His refusal to escalate the violence speaks volumes about the strength of his character and his understanding of true justice. As the confrontation settled, Marcus didn't rush away. He took a moment to look around at the wreckage of the situation. His gadget was still damaged, his flag torn, but something had changed. The pain he had felt earlier, the sting of the slurs, the violation of his space had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness, but a quiet acceptance of the lesson that had to be taught. He had made Doug and Sherry see the consequences of their hate, and that was enough for now. They could go on hurling insults and living in their small-minded world, but they would never be the same again. The image of Marcus, calm and in control, would haunt them for a long time. This final act of restraint and reflection reminds me of how real healing often comes not from retribution, but from a deeper understanding of our own strength. In a world where people are often told to fight fire with fire, Marcus shows us that true strength comes from the ability to choose peace, to stand firm without aggression. He teaches us that justice doesn't always require a loud response. Sometimes, it's about letting the consequences of someone's actions speak for themselves. The power of this quiet confrontation lies in the lesson it leaves behind, both for Doug and Sherry and for Marcus himself. We often hear about street justice or the desire for payback, but what Marcus has done here is show that there's a greater justice that transcends these concepts. It's not about getting even, It's about ensuring that the message is clear that no one is above the law. No one is free to hurt others without facing the truth of their actions. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of what had transpired. Doug and Sherry hadn't just been physically bested by Marcus, they had been confronted with the stark reality of their hatred. And in that silence, Marcus didn't need to say a word. The moment spoke for itself. The lesson had been learned. In a world that often values noise, aggression, and the need to be heard, Marcus's silence was a powerful tool. It wasn't the silence of fear or submission. It was the silence of someone who had already said everything he needed to say. It was a silence that would linger long after the confrontation was over, leaving Doug and Sherry with nothing but their own guilt to contend with. As news of the confrontation spread throughout the neighborhood, things began to shift. The silence that had once enveloped the community, a silence born from fear and complacency, started to crack. People who had once turned a blind eye to Doug and Sherry's behavior began to see them for what they truly were, bullies hiding behind their hatred. It wasn't just Marcus who had been affected by this. The entire neighborhood was forced to confront its own role in allowing such behavior to persist. Neighbors who had avoided Marcus now found themselves acknowledging him. The woman across the street, who had once looked away when the vandalism had occurred, now nodded to him as she took out her trash. The subtle shift in the atmosphere was palpable. People no longer saw Marcus as just a man living in the neighborhood. They saw him as someone who had stood up for what was right, someone who had given them a chance to confront their own silence. This shift in the neighborhood mirrors what happens in larger communities when one person steps up to challenge the status quo. It's easy to ignore injustice when it doesn't directly affect us, but when someone takes a stand, others start to see the cracks in the system. Marcus, by standing tall and confronting Doug and Sherry, didn't just impact their lives, he changed the dynamics of the entire community. And though it wasn't immediate or dramatic, that change was real. The real work of justice often happens in these quiet moments of reflection, when individuals like Marcus refuse to stay silent in the face of hate. By refusing to back down, Marcus not only confronted Doug and Sherry's racism, but he also forced everyone around him to question their own role in perpetuating such behavior. This is how social change begins, not with loud protests or acts of defiance, but with quiet acts of courage that challenge the prevailing norms. At the heart of Marcus's journey is a powerful lesson that silence can be louder than words and restraint stronger than brute force. His ability to remain calm in the face of provocation, to stand tall without lashing out, showcases a quiet strength that is often overlooked in a world that glorifies immediate reactions and raw emotion. Marcus didn't need to fight fire with fire. He understood that real power comes from within, and that by controlling his emotions, he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. The key takeaway here is that sometimes the most profound acts of resistance don't require loud defiance or aggression. Instead, they demand the courage to remain composed in the face of adversity. When Marcus didn't react impulsively, when he didn't fall into the trap of violence, he became the one who truly controlled the situation. His silence was his weapon, his calmness a shield. In a society that often feels like it rewards loud reactions, Marcus teaches us that patience and self-control can be far more powerful. Throughout the entire story, one of the most striking lessons is the notion of consequences. Marcus didn't seek to punish Doug and Sherry in the traditional sense. He didn't lash out to make them feel the same pain he did. Instead, he made them confront the consequences of their actions, not just in the form of the confrontation, but through their realization that their behavior had repercussions in a wider community. By standing firm and not responding with aggression, Marcus forced Doug and Sherry to confront their own hatred. And it was in that confrontation, when they realized they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that they faced the real consequence of their actions, not just losing a fight, but losing their self-perceived power and control. They were forced to see themselves as they truly were, stripped of the facade of superiority they had built around their hate. This lesson applies beyond personal confrontation. In a world filled with injustice, we often want to respond immediately and get back at those who have wronged us. But Marcus shows us that real change happens when we let others see the long-term consequences of their actions. Sometimes, the most powerful form of justice is letting someone realize the impact of their behavior without resorting to anger or violence. Marcus's experience also speaks to the importance of representation. By standing firm and asserting his dignity, Marcus became a symbol not just for himself, but for anyone who has been marginalized or oppressed. His decision to take a stand wasn't just personal. It was the message to the larger community. Marcus didn't let Doug and Sherry define who he was. He defined himself through his actions, and in doing so, he set an example for others. The community around him, initially silent and complicit in its avoidance of the issue, began to wake up. The moment Marcus refused to back down was a catalyst for change in his neighborhood. People who had once turned a blind eye began to realize that they, too, were complicit in allowing such behavior to continue. Marcus's quiet act of defiance rippled outwards, encouraging others to reflect on their own actions and inactions. This lesson is crucial. When you stand up for what is right, especially in the face of overwhelming opposition, you inspire others to do the same. Representation isn't just about occupying space. It's about showing others that they, too, have the power to make change. At its core, Marcus's story is about belonging. Doug and Sherry believed they had the right to dictate who belonged in their neighborhood and who didn't. They sought to tear down Marcus's sense of belonging by destroying his property, insulting his identity, and mocking his service. But Marcus, through his quiet strength, shows us that true belonging is not given to us by others, it is something we claim for ourselves. Marcus didn't let Doug and Sherry define his worth. He didn't let their hatred steal his sense of identity or his place in the world. Despite their best efforts to strip him of his dignity, Marcus stood tall because he knew that belonging isn't about fitting into someone else's narrow definition. It's about owning who you are and being unapologetically yourself. This lesson applies to anyone who has ever felt excluded or marginalized. We often look to others for validation, for permission to belong, but true belonging comes from within. When we stop seeking approval from those who seek to exclude us, we can find the strength to claim our rightful place in the world. In the final moments, Marcus doesn't seek revenge. He doesn't chase after Doug and Sherry. Instead, he walks away, not with a sense of victory over them, but with a sense of peace. He knows that the cycle of hatred and retaliation ends when one person chooses to stop it. By choosing restraint and patience, Marcus stops the endless cycle of violence and vengeance. This is perhaps the most profound lesson, that we have the power to end cycles of hate. We can choose to break the pattern and create a new path forward. It is easy to get caught in a never-ending cycle of retaliation, but real peace comes when we choose to rise above and not let the past dictate our future actions. Marcus teaches us that while we cannot always control the actions of others, we can control how we respond, and in doing so, we have the power to break the chains of hatred that bind us. What Marcus teaches us is simple yet profound. Strength is not about how loudly you can shout, how violently you can fight, or how much you can retaliate. Strength lies in the power of restraint, in the quiet decision to stand firm in your beliefs and let your actions speak louder than words. Marcus's story isn't just about revenge or retribution. It's about something far more powerful, the ability to hold your ground and make others see the truth of their actions without raising a fist or shouting in anger. Through patience, understanding, and a quiet sense of justice, Marcus brings about the kind of change that speaks volumes to the people who need it the most. For everyone who has ever felt overlooked, oppressed, or marginalized, Marcus's story is a reminder that true power lies within you. You don't need to fight every battle with aggression. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is simply stand tall and let your presence change the world around you.